patience is important.
Yes. It's important to understand patience. Because you don't have to have patience when anything sustainable is going to require patience.
I don't think patience is necessary.
It depends on what you say patience is.
Patience.
What is patience?
It could be different. But it's just like taking the time away from something. I don't like waiting for nothing.
See, yeah, the microwave world, man.
But the hospital is the patience like you know that it's coming. It's like you know.
Patience could be anything. So what would you define patience be? What would your description of patience be?
I wouldn't think of patience like faith. I'd say patience is like something you don't have control in, but it's like, would you say perseverance? No, not patience. I don't think patience is necessary.
The amount of time you're willing to wait. So it's like, for somebody, their meter of impatience could be 30 seconds in certain situations. And somebody else could be okay 5 years, a year. That's from like instant like gratification when you're like doing something, bro. But
You're watching two brothers argue about where to eat in Miami. Nothing serious, just typical family back and forth about restaurants and indecision. But somewhere in that conversation, something shifted. The argument stopped being about food entirely and landed on something way bigger, whether patience actually matters at all. And here's where it gets interesting because Shedeur Sanders didn't hesitate when answering. He went all in on patience, explaining that anything worth building requires it. His brother Shilo immediately pushed back hard, saying patience is overrated in a world built for instant results. But then Shedeur did something unexpected. He didn't just defend patience as some abstract virtue. He redefined it completely, turning it into something strategic, calculated, and deliberate that has absolutely nothing to do with what most people think patience actually means. And if you're paying attention, this casual dinner conversation reveals more about how this young quarterback actually thinks under pressure than any prepared interview ever could. Because by the end of the night, a small, throwaway moment proved his entire argument right in real time. Keep watching because once you understand what Shedeur was actually describing, you'll see his mindset completely differently heading into this entire season in Cleveland. Picture this. Two brothers in Miami, casual evening, just trying to figure out where they want to grab dinner. Nothing complicated, nothing earth-shattering, just the kind of decision most families make every single day without thinking twice about it. Shedeur and Shilo are bouncing between options, going back and forth, clearly getting a little frustrated with each other's indecision. One wants this spot, the other's not sold. They're debating the merits of different restaurants, the vibe, what sounds good right now versus what might be better. It's the kind of conversation that usually just dissolves into, I don't care, you pick, or someone finally making a call and moving on with their night. But this one didn't play out that way. Somewhere in the middle of that back and forth about which restaurant made more sense, something unexpected happened. The conversation didn't stay surface level. It didn't just stay about food and location and timing. Instead, it shifted into something way deeper, something philosophical even. One of them, probably out of frustration with all the indecision, asked a question that completely reframed the entire discussion. Do you think patience is actually important? Now that's not the kind of question that usually comes up during a casual dinner debate. That's the kind of question that makes you stop for a second and actually think before you answer. But Shedeur didn't hesitate. His response was immediate and direct. Yes, he said, patience matters, and not just in casual situations either. He explained that anything built to actually last, anything sustainable, anything worth having, it requires patience to get there. No shortcuts. No quick fixes. No way around it. That's a pretty strong stance to take, especially when you're just trying to decide where to eat. But that's the thing about genuine conviction. It comes through in casual moments, not just in prepared statements. And the second he made that argument, his brother pushed back just as hard. Shilo wasn't buying it. He said directly that he doesn't think patience is necessary at all. And he framed his counterargument in a way that actually makes sense if you think about the world we're living in right now. He described himself as someone who doesn't like waiting for anything. He's the type of person who wants things to happen now, who gets frustrated with delay, who sees indecision as a waste of time. And he connected that to something bigger, talking about how the world we live in now is built like a microwave. Everything is instant. Everything is immediate. Results are expected right away. Information moves at lightning speed. Why would you need patience in a world that's literally designed to eliminate waiting? Why would you accept delay when you could have the answer or the result or the decision right now? It's actually a compelling argument if you don't dig deeper. But that's where the conversation got interesting because Shedeur didn't just dismiss Shilo's point. He didn't roll his eyes and move on. Instead, the two brothers started actually debating this, pushing back and forth, both standing their ground, neither one backing down completely. This is the moment where you start realizing this isn't just casual banter. These aren't surface-level opinions they're throwing out for the sake of having something to talk about. This is genuine disagreement between two people who clearly think about these things differently. And the more they went back and forth, the more you could see that this family operates on genuine, honest communication. They're comfortable disagreeing with each other. They're not afraid to challenge each other's thinking. They don't need everything to be harmonious and agreeable. They can sit with tension and discomfort and still keep the conversation going, still respect each other, still finish dinner together without resentment building up. That's actually a rare dynamic in a lot of families, especially in high-pressure situations where you might expect everyone to just keep things surface level and polite. But what makes this moment worth paying attention to isn't really the fact that they disagreed. It's that the disagreement was genuine enough that it forced Shedeur to actually articulate what he meant by patience. Because Shilo's pushback created a situation where vague statements about patience being important weren't going to cut it anymore. Shedeur had to get specific. He had to explain exactly what he meant, exactly how he was thinking about it, exactly why he believed patience mattered when his own brother was saying it didn't. And that's when things got really interesting, because the definition Shedeur gave was nothing like what most people would expect when they hear the word patience. It wasn't soft. It wasn't passive. It wasn't about being resigned to waiting. Instead, it was calculated, strategic, and built around something completely different than what the word usually implies. And once you hear how he defines it, you start understanding not just his perspective on patience, but his entire approach to handling uncertain situations, pressure, timing, and long-term goals. That definition became the key to understanding how this young quarterback is actually thinking about the competition he's facing in Cleveland right now. When Shilo pushes back on patience, he's not just being argumentative for the sake of it. He's representing a genuinely valid perspective that a lot of people actually hold, especially in the world we're living in right now. His argument is built around urgency, decisiveness, and action. He's saying that patience is overrated, that waiting is a waste of time, and that in a world designed for instant results, the person who acts first often wins. And honestly, there's something compelling about that viewpoint if you don't think too deeply about it. Because we do live in an era of instant gratification. We have information at our fingertips. We can get decisions made in seconds instead of days. We don't have to wait for anything anymore. You want to know something, you Google it. You want to buy something, it's at your door tomorrow. You want to communicate with someone, you text them and get a response within minutes. The infrastructure of modern life is literally built to eliminate waiting, so why would you need patience? Shilo frames this in personal terms too. He says directly that he doesn't like waiting for anything. He's someone who wants things to happen now, who gets frustrated with indecision, who sees delay as frustrating rather than necessary. And there's an authenticity to that perspective because a lot of people genuinely feel that way. They're wired for speed. They're energized by action. They get anxious when things move slowly. They see patience as passive, as settling, as giving up on what you really want in favor of some theoretical long-term benefit that might not even materialize. From that lens, patience isn't a virtue. It's a weakness. It's what people do when they don't have the power or the confidence to make things happen themselves. It's an excuse for not taking control of your own situation. The way Shilo presents this argument, you can tell he's thought about it before. This isn't a throwaway comment. He's genuinely built a worldview around the idea that you don't need patience if you're decisive enough, if you're willing to act, if you're confident in your own ability to navigate situations without waiting for permission or for circumstances to align perfectly. He's arguing for a kind of autonomy and agency that's appealing, especially to young people who are trying to carve out their own path. Why wait for someone else to hand you an opportunity when you can create one yourself? Why wait for the perfect moment when you can force the moment to bend to your will? Why accept patience when you could demand action? And here's where Shilo's argument actually connects to something real in the modern world. We do celebrate the people who move fast, who break things, who don't wait for permission, who push through obstacles without hesitation. We celebrate the entrepreneurs who quit their jobs without a safety net. We celebrate the athletes who demand trades instead of waiting for their opportunity. We celebrate the people who take control of their own narrative instead of letting circumstances define them. So Shilo's perspective isn't coming from nowhere. It's grounded in a worldview that actually works in certain contexts. There are absolutely situations where waiting is the wrong call, where patience is an excuse for inaction, where the person who moves first has a massive advantage. Shilo's not wrong about that fundamentally. The question is whether that applies to every situation, and that's where the disagreement actually gets interesting. Because when Shilo says he doesn't think patience is necessary, he's really saying that he believes you can control more of your own circumstances than Shedeur is suggesting. He's arguing that if you're skilled enough, if you're confident enough, if you're willing to act decisively, you can create the outcomes you want without having to wait for external factors to align. You can force your own timeline. You can make things happen on your schedule instead of accepting someone else's schedule. And that's an appealing belief because it puts you in control. It makes you the author of your own story. It suggests that your success or failure is entirely dependent on your own effort and courage, rather than on patience or luck or timing or factors outside of your control. But here's the thing about Shilo's argument that becomes important as the conversation develops. He's not necessarily wrong, he's just incomplete. Because while it's true that some situations reward immediate action and decisiveness, other situations absolutely require patience. And the real skill isn't choosing one or the other. It's knowing which situation you're actually in. It's understanding when to push and when to wait, when to act decisively, and when to accept that you're not fully in control of the timeline. Shilo's presenting a worldview that's built around control and agency, which is powerful, but it's also a worldview that can get you into trouble if you apply it in situations where you actually don't have as much control as you think you do. And that's the tension that Shedeur explores in his response. He's not dismissing Shilo's point entirely. He's acknowledging that, yes, there are situations where you need to act decisively. But he's pushing back on the idea that patience is never necessary, and he's about to redefine what patience actually is in a way that makes Shilo's pushback seem incomplete. This is where the conversation gets really interesting, because Shedeur doesn't just defend the abstract concept of patience. Instead, he completely redefines what patience actually is, turning it into something that sounds nothing like the textbook definition most people would expect. When Shilo pushed back hard, refusing to accept that patience is necessary, Shedeur had to get specific about what he actually meant. And the definition he gives is calculated, strategic, and built around something entirely different than passive waiting. He says that patience isn't really about waiting at all. It's about the amount of time you're willing to wait. And that sounds simple until he breaks it down further. He explains that everyone has what he calls a meter of impatience. For some people, that meter is 30 seconds. In certain situations, they can't wait more than half a minute before they need to act or they'll lose their mind. For other people, that same meter extends to months or years. They're comfortable waiting a year, 2 years, 5 years if they believe it's necessary. And that difference between people isn't moral or virtuous or weak. It's just a difference in how they're wired and how they assess situations. Shedeur's recognizing that patience isn't one-size-fits-all. It's contextual. It's dependent on the situation and the person and what's actually at stake. Some things genuinely do require patience measured in years. Other things might require patience measured in seconds. The key is understanding which is which. But then he goes deeper, and this is where it gets really strategic. He explains that patience, to him, isn't about just waiting blindly and hoping things work out. It's about leverage. It's about understanding the outcomes that will result from different timing decisions and choosing the timing that produces the best result. He says directly, if you wait on this, will the outcome be more effective than if you hurry up and do it fast? And here's the critical part. He adds that he can only have patience if he already knows what result he's going to get either way. He can compare the fast path and the slow path, see that the slow path produces a better outcome, and then wait for that better outcome. But that's not passive patience. That's strategic timing. That's leverage. Think about how calculated that actually is. Because Shedeur isn't describing someone who's resigned to waiting. He's describing someone who's actively making a decision about timing based on expected outcomes. He's weighing the cost of acting now versus the benefit of waiting and choosing the path that produces the superior result. That's a completely different thing than patience in the way most people think about it. Most people think of patience as virtue, as something you do because you're supposed to, as accepting that things will happen when they happen. But Shedeur is describing patience as a tactical decision. It's something you do because the math works out. It's something you do because you've thought through the outcomes, and waiting actually produces a better result than acting now. And here's where his brother's pushback forces him to go even further into the philosophy. Shilo's arguing that you can control more than Shedeur is suggesting. You can make things happen on your timeline. You don't need to wait. And Shedeur responds by saying that's only true if you're the one calling all the shots. If you're the one with total control, then patience becomes optional. But the second you become dependent on anything outside of yourself, patience becomes necessary whether you like it or not. That's not optional. That's just reality. He connects this to something bigger. Things aren't going to happen on your timeline just because you want them to happen on your timeline. That's not how the world works. You can't control everything around you. You can't force other people to move at your pace. You can't make circumstances align through sheer willpower. The world is largely uncontrollable. All you can actually control is what you do within that uncontrollable world. And the second you accept that fact, patience stops being optional. It becomes something you have to develop because it's an inevitable part of existing in a world you don't fully control. But here's the nuance that Shedeur adds that most people miss entirely. He's careful to say that patience isn't always the right call either. Sometimes you're being patient about something that doesn't actually require patience. Sometimes waiting is just an excuse to avoid taking action when you should be taking action. Sometimes patience means you miss an opportunity that was actually available right now. So the real skill, according to Shedeur, isn't learning to be patient all the time. It's learning to distinguish between situations that actually require patience and situations that don't. It's knowing when to wait because the outcome will be better, and when to act because waiting will only cost you something real. That distinction is incredibly mature for a young athlete to articulate this clearly, and this completely unscripted in the middle of a casual dinner conversation. Most people don't sit down and think through timing this deliberately. Most people either default to action or default to waiting without actually assessing which is appropriate for the specific situation they're in. But Shedeur is describing a framework where you actively evaluate each situation, understand what's at stake, understand what you can control and what you can't, and make deliberate decisions about timing based on expected outcomes. That's not passive patience. That's calculated decision-making disguised as patience. The moment Shilo tries to find an exception to Shedeur's argument is the moment the conversation reaches its philosophical peak. He asks directly, is there any world where patience simply isn't required at all? Is there a scenario where you can just act decisively without needing to wait for anything? And Shedeur's response cuts right to the core of the disagreement. His answer is essentially no. Not if you're dependent on anything outside of yourself. Not if you're working toward any long-term goal. Not if you need anything from anyone or anything else. And that covers basically everything that matters in life. Think about that for a second. Shedeur is saying that unless you're completely autonomous, completely self-sufficient, completely capable of achieving everything you want entirely on your own without needing anything from anyone else, patience becomes unavoidable. And honestly, that's almost nobody. Even the most ambitious, most driven, most aggressive people in the world are dependent on something outside of themselves. They're dependent on markets, on timing, on other people's decisions, on circumstances aligning. They might have more control than most people, but they don't have total control. And the second you don't have total control, patience stops being optional. Shedeur is making an argument about the structure of reality, not just about virtue or philosophy. He's saying that the world simply doesn't work the way Shilo is suggesting. You can't will things into happening on your exact timeline. You can't force circumstances to align just because you want them to. You can't control other people's decisions. You can't control market forces. You can't control timing. You can only control your own actions and your own responses to situations. Everything else is outside of your authority. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner patience stops feeling like weakness and starts feeling like wisdom. This is a crucial distinction that changes how you understand not just his philosophy on patience, but his entire approach to the quarterback competition he's facing in Cleveland. Because a quarterback competition, by definition, isn't something you have total control over. You can control how hard you work. You can control your preparation. You can control your attitude and your approach in practice. But you can't control the coach's decision. You can't control what the other quarterback does. You can't control how the media frames the competition. You can't control how the fans react. You can't control injuries or circumstances or timing. You can only control your own performance and your own mindset. Everything else is dependent on factors outside of your authority. And that's the reality Shedeur is describing when he talks about the necessity of patience. He's not being passive about it. He's not saying you should just accept defeat or accept being benched forever. He's saying that you need to understand what you can actually control and what you can't, and then make strategic decisions about timing based on that understanding. You wait for your opportunity not because you're weak, but because you understand that opportunities don't appear on demand. They appear when circumstances align. And you want to be ready when they do align, not desperate and unprepared because you've been pushing for something before the moment was right. The nuance here is important though, and Shedeur makes sure to include it. He says that patience isn't always right either. Sometimes the right move is to push. Sometimes the right move is to demand your opportunity. Sometimes the right move is to take control and force your own timeline. But that's only right if you have the leverage to do it, if you're confident in your own ability to make it work, if the situation actually supports that kind of aggressive action. The person who can distinguish between those moments, who can read a situation and understand whether patience or aggression is actually appropriate, that's the person who comes out ahead. This is where you start seeing the connection to what Shedeur is actually doing in Cleveland. He's not sitting around passively accepting a backup role. He's not avoiding competition or shrinking from the challenge. But he's also not pushing so hard that he's forcing a timeline that isn't ready. He's assessing the situation. He's understanding what he can control and what he can't. He's preparing as if he's going to get his opportunity, but he's not demanding it before circumstances actually line up for him to succeed. He's being strategic about it. He's leveraging patience as a tool, not accepting it as a limitation. And the bigger implication that Shedeur doesn't state directly, but that becomes clear as the conversation develops, is that this kind of thinking actually gives you an advantage in situations like quarterback competitions. Because while other players might be pushing too hard, trying to force a timeline, creating tension and frustration, Shedeur's the player who understands that his job is to be ready whenever the moment comes. Not to force the moment to come before it's ready. Not to demand something he hasn't actually earned yet, but to prepare relentlessly while accepting that the exact timing of his opportunity isn't completely in his hands. That might sound like a subtle difference, but it's the difference between a player who comes in desperate and unprepared and a player who comes in confident and ready. And that makes all the difference when your moment finally arrives. Here's the part of Shedeur's philosophy that separates genuine maturity from naive optimism. He's not saying that patience is always right. He's not saying that you should just wait around and everything will work out eventually. He's not describing a passive approach to life where you just accept whatever comes your way. He's describing something way more nuanced and way more sophisticated than that. He explicitly says that patience isn't always the right call. Sometimes waiting on something that doesn't actually require patience just means missing an opportunity you could have already acted on. Sometimes patience is an excuse for inaction. Sometimes patience is cowardice disguised as virtue. And understanding when patience is actually necessary and when it's just an excuse to avoid taking action, that's the real skill. Think about how mature that distinction is, because a lot of people take their philosophy of patience to an extreme. They either decide that patience is always right and they'll just wait forever for things to magically happen, or they decide that patience is always wrong and they need to be aggressive and decisive in every single situation. but Shedeur's describing a middle ground where you have to actively assess each situation and understand what it actually requires. Sometimes the right move is to push. Sometimes the right move is to wait. And the person who can read the situation correctly, who can understand what's actually required in that specific context, that's the person who wins. He gives a very specific example that makes this clear. He talks about knowing whether to wait on something based on whether he already knows what the outcome is going to be. If he doesn't know what the outcome will be, if he's waiting blindly just hoping that things work out eventually, that's not patience. That's just passivity. But if he already understands the outcome difference, if he can see clearly that waiting will produce a better result, then patience makes sense. Then it's strategic. Then it's leverage. But if he's waiting for something where the outcome is uncertain, where he doesn't actually know if waiting will help or hurt, then patience might be the wrong call. Then he might need to act decisively and gather information through action rather than through waiting. This is where Shedeur's philosophy gets really practical and really applicable to real situations. Because most people don't have perfect information. Most people are making decisions without knowing exactly how things are going to turn out. So the question becomes, how do you make smart decisions about patience when you don't have complete information? And his answer is that you have to assess the risk-reward ratio. You have to ask yourself, what am I risking by waiting? What am I gaining by waiting? What am I risking by acting now? What am I gaining by acting now? And then you make the decision based on that assessment. In a quarterback competition, that looks like this. Shedeur could push hard right now, demand the starting job immediately, create controversy and drama, and demand his opportunity. That might get him on the field faster. But it also risks alienating the coaching staff, creating tension in the locker room, and possibly forcing a situation before he's actually ready to succeed. Or he can be patient, prepare relentlessly, trust that when the moment comes he'll be ready, and understand that forcing the moment before he's ready won't actually serve him. That's not passive. That's strategic. He's made a decision about timing based on understanding what serves his long-term goal better. But the key part that Shedeur emphasizes is that you have to actually think about this. You can't just default to patience or default to action. You have to assess what the situation actually requires. And that assessment requires honesty. It requires self-awareness. It requires understanding your own abilities and limitations. It requires understanding the actual circumstances around you, not just the circumstances as you wish they were. Because if you're waiting for something that requires immediate action, you're going to lose. But if you're pushing for something that requires patience, you're also going to lose. The real skill is knowing which is which. This is why the conversation between Shedeur and Shilo is so revealing, because neither of them is completely right. Shilo's not wrong that there are situations where you need to push, where patience is just an excuse for inaction. Shedeur's not wrong that there are situations where patience is actually necessary, where you can't control the timeline. The truth is in the combination. The real skill is knowing when to do which. And the fact that Shedeur understands this nuance, the fact that he can articulate that patience isn't always right, but it's also not never right. That's what suggests he's actually thought through how to handle his own situation in Cleveland. Because if Shedeur had said that patience is always right, you'd worry about him being passive, about him accepting a backup role indefinitely without pushing for his opportunity. But because he understands that patience isn't always right, because he understands that sometimes you need to be aggressive and demand your moment, you can see that he's not going to just accept indefinite benchwarming. He's going to push when it's appropriate to push. He's just not going to push before he's actually ready to succeed. That distinction matters more than people realize when you're trying to understand what kind of competitor he actually is. Here's the moment that proves Shedeur's entire philosophical argument in real time, and it's perfect because it's so small and so ordinary that most people would just brush past it without thinking twice. Later that same evening, after all the philosophical debate about patience and timing and control, the group is at the restaurant they finally picked. And there's a moment where they're considering trying a drink that the restaurant is known for. Shedeur's initial reaction is dismissive. He almost decides not to try it. He assumes it won't be made properly. He assumes it'll be a waste of time and money. His instinct is to skip it, to move on, to not bother waiting for something he's already decided probably won't be good. But then something happens. Instead of dismissing it entirely, he pauses. He decides to wait. He decides to try it anyway. And when he does, when he actually goes through with it despite his initial skepticism, it turns out to be exactly what he wanted. It's made perfectly. It tastes exactly right. It meets his expectations and maybe even exceeds them. And here's the beautiful part. Shedeur doesn't just move past that moment like nothing happened. He immediately connects it back to the larger conversation about patience that he and Shilo had been having. He points out in real time that this is exactly what he was talking about. This is patience working exactly the way he described it. He waited despite his initial skepticism. He accepted that he didn't have complete control over the outcome, that he couldn't know for certain if it would be good or bad before trying it. He made a strategic decision to wait and try it rather than dismissing it based on incomplete information. And the outcome proved him right. The drink was exactly what he wanted. And by immediately connecting that small moment back to the larger philosophical argument, Shedeur demonstrates something important. He's not just talking about patience as an abstract concept. He's actively thinking about patience in real time. He's actively applying his own philosophy to real situations as they happen. He's not preaching about something he doesn't actually practice. This is the kind of detail that matters way more than most people realize, because anyone can talk about philosophy. Anyone can articulate a worldview in abstract terms. But the person who actually lives according to that philosophy, who makes decisions based on it in real time without even having to think about it consciously, that's the person who's genuinely integrated that thinking into their entire approach to life. Shedeur didn't plan to use the drink moment as validation for his argument. He didn't set it up. He didn't manufacture it for the sake of proving his point. It just happened organically, and he recognized it in the moment. And the fact that he recognized it and immediately connected it back to the broader conversation suggests that he's actively thinking about these principles constantly. That has massive implications for how he approaches his situation in Cleveland. Because if Shedeur is actively thinking about patience and timing and strategic decision-making in casual situations, like choosing a drink at a restaurant, then he's almost certainly applying those same principles to his approach in the quarterback competition. He's not just passively waiting. He's actively assessing situations, making strategic decisions about when to push and when to wait, and preparing himself for whenever his moment comes. He's integrated patience not as a virtue, but as a practical tool into how he actually operates. The drink moment also proves something else about Shedeur's character. It shows that he's willing to challenge his own assumptions. His initial assumption was that the drink wouldn't be made properly. His default position was to skip it, but he was willing to pause that assumption and try it anyway. And when he was wrong, when the drink was actually perfect, he didn't get defensive about it. He didn't double down on his initial skepticism. He acknowledged that his first instinct was wrong, and that patience actually paid off in that situation. That kind of intellectual humility, that willingness to admit when you're wrong and adjust based on new information, that's another indicator of genuine maturity. In a competition situation, that kind of thinking is incredibly valuable. Because when things don't go exactly as you expected, when the situation changes, when the coaching staff makes decisions you didn't anticipate, the person who can quickly assess what's actually happening and adjust their approach accordingly is the person who succeeds. The person who digs in and refuses to adapt, who insists that their original plan should have worked, that person struggles. Shedeur's demonstrating that he can do the former. He can acknowledge when his assumptions are wrong. He can adapt. He can be flexible while still maintaining his core philosophy. And perhaps most importantly, the drink moment shows that Shedeur understands something that a lot of young athletes don't. He understands that there's value in things you didn't expect. There's value in experiences that you didn't have complete control over. There's value in being willing to wait for something even when you're not entirely sure what the outcome will be. Because sometimes the best things in life are the ones you almost missed because you were too quick to dismiss them based on incomplete information. And if that translates to his approach in football, if he's willing to put in work even when he's not guaranteed of the outcome, if he's willing to prepare for opportunities that might not come exactly when he wants them to come, then that's what separates good players from great players. That's the difference between someone who succeeds when things go exactly as planned and someone who succeeds even when things get messy and uncertain. The way Shedeur and Shilo interact throughout this entire exchange is actually just as revealing as the philosophical argument itself. Because this isn't a debate where one person is clearly right and the other is clearly wrong, with one brother backing down or conceding the point. Both of them stand their ground. Both of them maintain their position. Neither one completely dismisses the other's argument, even though they disagree fundamentally on something important. And that dynamic, the way they can hold a genuine philosophical disagreement without it devolving into conflict or resentment, says something crucial about how this family actually operates. You can tell that these two have had this exact type of conversation before. They're comfortable with disagreement. They've clearly been around each other long enough to develop different perspectives on the world, and neither of them has a problem expressing those differences. But here's what matters. The disagreement doesn't create tension that carries into the rest of their evening. They don't stop respecting each other. They don't take it personally. They just debate the merits of their positions, maintain their ground, and then move on with their night together laughing and continuing dinner. That kind of dynamic is actually rare in a lot of families. Shilo's pushing back isn't just for the sake of arguing either. He genuinely believes what he's saying. His perspective, built around urgency and instant decision-making, reflects a genuinely different but equally valid approach to life. It's an approach built on decisiveness rather than deliberation. And the fact that Shedeur can engage with that perspective seriously, can acknowledge that it has validity in certain contexts, while still maintaining his own perspective, that shows intellectual flexibility. He's not being dismissive of his brother's viewpoint. He's engaging with it. He's taking it seriously. But he's also holding firm on his own position because he believes it's more broadly applicable than Shilo's perspective. And what's interesting is that the conversation doesn't end with either of them fully converting the other. Shedeur doesn't convince Shilo that patience is always necessary. Shilo doesn't convince Shedeur that patience is overrated. Instead, what happens is that through the conversation, both of them develop a slightly more nuanced understanding of the topic. And maybe that's the real point. Maybe the value isn't in changing each other's minds, but in being willing to genuinely engage with a different perspective and let that engagement deepen your own thinking. This matters for Shedeur's situation in Cleveland for several reasons. First, it shows that he's comfortable with conflict. He's not someone who needs everything to be harmonious and agreed upon. He can sit with tension without letting it destabilize him. That's huge for a young quarterback in a competitive situation where there might be conflict with coaching staff or other players or media criticism. If you're the kind of person who falls apart when there's disagreement, when there's tension, when people don't agree with you, you're not going to handle competition well. But if you're comfortable with conflict, if you can engage with it honestly and move forward without resentment, you're much better equipped to handle the pressures of professional sports. Second, it shows that Shedeur isn't closed off to other perspectives. He's willing to listen to his brother's argument even though it's contrary to his own position. He's willing to take it seriously. He's willing to engage with it intellectually. That kind of openness, that willingness to consider other viewpoints without immediately dismissing them, is incredibly valuable in a competitive environment. Because if you're unwilling to listen to feedback, unwilling to consider that maybe your approach isn't optimal, unwilling to adapt based on new information, you're going to struggle when circumstances change or when you need to evolve your approach. Third, the dynamic between them shows that Shedeur doesn't need external validation. He doesn't need his brother to agree with him for him to feel confident in his own position. He can be outnumbered in an argument and still maintain his perspective because he believes in it. That's a quality that's absolutely necessary for a young quarterback in a competitive situation where everyone is questioning whether he's good enough, whether he deserves the opportunity, whether he should be benched. If you need everyone around you to agree with you, if you need constant external validation, you're going to be fragile in that environment. But if you can hold firm in your own convictions while still remaining open to feedback and criticism, while still being willing to adjust if circumstances warrant it, that's what separates quarterbacks who succeed under pressure from quarterbacks who crumble. The way Shedeur and Shilo engage with each other also suggests something about the broader family dynamic in their household. These are two young people who have clearly been encouraged to think for themselves, to develop their own perspectives, to express those perspectives even if they're contrary to family members. There's a culture in that family of genuine dialogue rather than just obedience or agreement. And that kind of environment, where independent thinking is valued and honest disagreement is accepted, tends to produce people who are more confident, more adaptable, more able to handle pressure and uncertainty. Because the person who's been taught from a young age that it's okay to disagree, that it's okay to stand by your convictions even when other people think you're wrong, that it's okay to be wrong sometimes and adjust based on new information, that person has been practicing resilience their entire life. They've been developing the mental flexibility and the confidence that's necessary to handle the uncertainty and pressure that comes with professional sports. They're not going to be destroyed by criticism because they've been exposed to genuine disagreement in a healthy context their entire life. They're not going to be fragile when their approach is questioned because they're used to defending their perspective and being willing to adjust it based on evidence. Here's the thing that people might miss if they're just watching this as a cute moment between two brothers debating patience over dinner. This casual, completely unscripted conversation reveals more about Shedeur's actual readiness for the quarterback competition he's facing than any single practice stat line, any interview answer, any prepared statement could possibly show. And that's worth sitting with for a moment, because most people evaluate young athletes based on the wrong metrics. They look at physical tools. How fast is he? How strong is he? How accurate is his arm? They look at statistics. What's his completion percentage? How many touchdowns? How many interceptions? They look at measurables and combine results and tape breakdowns. And all of those things matter. Physical tools matter. Statistics matter. But what doesn't show up on any of those metrics is mindset. What doesn't show up on any measurable is how a player actually thinks about pressure, about competition, about uncertainty, about timing. And mindset is actually the biggest predictor of which young quarterback is going to succeed in a competitive situation, and which one is going to crumble. Because here's what Shedeur is describing in that dinner conversation. He's describing a completely deliberate, calculated framework for handling situations he can't fully control. And that is exactly the situation he's in right now in Cleveland. He can't fully control whether he gets the starting job. He can't fully control how the coaching staff evaluates him. He can't fully control how injuries affect the depth chart, or how the team performs, or what the media says about him. All of that is outside of his complete authority. But what he can control is his preparation, his attitude, his response to uncertainty, his willingness to wait for the right moment rather than forcing a moment that's not ready. If Shedeur genuinely approaches this season with the same mindset he's laying out over dinner, if he's actually thinking about which situations require patience and which situations require action, if he's strategically leveraging his preparation against his opportunity, then he's exactly the kind of mental foundation that helps a young quarterback handle an uncertain depth chart without losing his composure or his confidence. Because he's not going to fall apart if he's not the starter immediately. He's not going to lose focus if it takes longer than he expected. He's not going to panic or get desperate or do something stupid that derails his career. Instead, he's going to stay patient but strategic. He's going to prepare as if he's the starter. He's going to get better every single day. He's going to be ready whenever his moment comes. And when that moment does come, whenever the opportunity finally arrives, he's going to walk into it prepared, confident, and mentally ready rather than desperate and unprepared because he's been waiting for so long. Think about the difference between a player who's been waiting passively and a player who's been waiting strategically. The passive player resents the time he's spent on the bench. He's angry that he didn't get his shot sooner. He's lost confidence because he hasn't been playing. He walks into his opportunity carrying all that resentment and frustration and doubt. He's not mentally sharp because his mind has been dwelling on what could have been rather than on what is. And the strategic player, the player who's been preparing relentlessly, the player who understands that the delay is part of the process, that player walks in ready. He's been staying sharp in practice. His confidence hasn't wavered because his confidence isn't dependent on whether he's starting or not. His confidence is dependent on whether he's prepared, and he knows he's prepared. That difference, the difference between a player who's resentful and mentally dull and a player who's prepared and mentally sharp, that's often the deciding factor in competitive situations. That's what separates the player who gets his chance and succeeds from the player who gets his chance and fails. Because the opportunity isn't enough. You also need the mindset to capitalize on the opportunity when it comes. And here's another level to this that makes it even more compelling. Shedeur's demonstrating that he understands something about professional sports that a lot of young athletes don't. He understands that there's value in the waiting period itself. He understands that the time spent preparing, the time spent getting better, the time spent studying, the time spent working on things that don't show up in statistics, all of that has value even if you're not currently playing in games. He's not treating the time on the bench as wasted time. He's treating it as opportunity time, time when he can improve in ways that his competition might not be improving. That's actually a massive mental advantage, because the player who's bitter about not playing, the player who's angry and resentful, that player is not using that time productively. That player is sitting in the locker room thinking about how unfair things are instead of thinking about how to be better. But the player who understands that patience with a purpose is valuable, the player who can see the waiting period as opportunity rather than punishment, that player is going to come out the other side better prepared than the competition. He's going to have spent the time not just waiting, but getting better. And when you think about that from a basketball perspective, when you think about how long these quarterback competitions sometimes take, the advantage goes to the patient player who's actively using that time to improve rather than the desperate player who's just waiting for his moment. By the time the moment comes, the patient player has had months or years to get better. The desperate player has just been waiting. And in a competition where the margins are razor thin, where small improvements can be the difference between success and failure, that extra preparation time becomes decisive. So when Shedeur's talking about patience as leverage, as strategic thinking, as calculated timing, he's not just describing a philosophy. He's describing an actual competitive advantage. To recap everything that actually matters from this casual dinner conversation in Miami, Shedeur Sanders articulated a genuinely thoughtful, strategic definition of patience that sounds nothing like what most people think patience actually is. He framed it not as passive acceptance, but as calculated leverage, as understanding when to wait and when to push based on expected outcomes. His brother Shilo pushed back with a completely different philosophy built around action and decisiveness. And instead of one of them completely winning the argument, both of them maintained their position while developing a slightly more nuanced understanding of the topic through genuine disagreement. What makes this conversation worth paying attention to isn't really the topic of patience itself. It's how naturally, how confidently, Shedeur was able to articulate a fully formed philosophy on something most people never actually sit down and think through. That kind of clarity doesn't usually appear out of nowhere in a casual setting. It comes from someone who's already spent real time reflecting on how he wants to operate, how he wants to think about pressure and timing and competition, long before any camera or any journalist was ever part of the equation. His prediction? This exact mindset, patience with purpose, strategic thinking about when to wait and when to push, this is going to be a massive part of why Shedeur eventually wins whatever opportunity comes his way in Cleveland. Because he's clearly already thought through exactly how to handle the waiting part of this process. He knows how to prepare strategically, he knows how to stay mentally sharp, and he knows how to be ready whenever his moment actually arrives.